for families who are victims of violence, and whereas the Tyriman Society is planning a greater online presence with Twitter and Facebook, and plans to further its work by tackling issues like bullying and hypersexualization. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the Legislative Assembly thank the Tyriman Society for the work they do in assisting victims of abuse and their continued efforts to educate about abuse, bullying, and hypersexualization. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Barring no more notices of motion, we'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 1:24. We'll conclude at 2:24. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. On Tuesday of this week, we learned that the government has committed another $5 million to the owners of the Nova Star ferry to cover the past season's losses. That brings the total commitment for taxpayers to $26 million, Mr. Speaker. And the minister responsible has all but admitted that there will be more subsidies to come in the future, including possibly for winter storage and for start-up again next season. Mr. Speaker, tourist operators, small business owners along the South Shore and across our province, Nova Scotia taxpayers, they all deserve to know that the government is handling this important service responsibly. I'd like to ask the Premier, will he produce a plan to show Nova Scotians that there is a plan for a sustainable ferry service from Yarmouth to Portland?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the question. I want to thank the member from Yarmouth for the tremendous work that he's done over the last number of years. To communicate to all Nova Scotians how important the Nova Scotia ferry is, which happens to land in Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker. When I travel from one end of this province to the other, I heard from tourism operators who asked us to put in place this service. We've kept that commitment, Mr. Speaker. We're working towards making sure that this service is sustainable in the long run. We have an operator that is providing service to the people of this province. I think it's premature for anyone in this House or to prejudge or judge by 4 months. We're going to continue to work to find savings. We have an auditor going in. We'll be looking at the books announced. There's been some costs associated with that. The Minister of Economic Development put in place protocols that ensure that the executive salaries were in line with what would take place with that service. So we're going to continue to work with that operator to ensure that that service is not only there for next year, but is there for the long run, so that all Nova Scotians can enjoy it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will note that in his list of thank yous, the Premier forgot to thank the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, whose money is making this all possible. Mr. Speaker, we all want the ferry to succeed. That is not the issue. The issue before Nova Scotians today, Mr. Speaker, is whether the government is doing a competent job of actually managing that service or not. I'll give you an example, Mr. Speaker. The Premier is hoping for a line of credit from the Governor of Maine in the amount of $5 million. Instantly, Mr. Speaker, that governor will either be elected or not a short 3 weeks from now. His chief opponent in the race for Governor of Maine was asked whether he would honour the commitment if he's elected, and he said, and I'll quote and then table it, "Before I do, it's important to make sure the operation is financially viable, that the business plan will work. You need to make sure taxpayers aren't left with a $5 million bill." Mr. Speaker, he sounds like a pretty good guy. I don't know what party he is, but clearly not the Liberals, Mr. Speaker. So there may be a $5 million line of credit, or there may not be a $5 million line of credit, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, who's looking after this service, what is the plan B? Is another $5 million bill coming to taxpayers to cover the state of Maine?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to tell all members of this House that the Minister of Economic and Rural Development has been doing a tremendous job ensuring that the state of Maine, Speaker, ensuring that the state of Maine plays a role and plays a part in ensuring that this service has long-term viability. As the leader of the Conservative Party has just alluded to, there is an election going on in the state of Maine. And if anyone in this House should know the crazy things that happen in an election campaign, it should be the leader of the official opposition when he promised to give $1 billion tax cuts to the people of the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if anyone knows what crazy things can happen in election campaigns, it's the people of Nova Scotia that now see a Liberal government that won the election, but who have already committed 7 years' worth of funding in 1 year, plus $5 million, plus maybe more for winter storage, plus maybe more to start it up again next year. Mr. Speaker, the crazy thing is they have no vision, no long-term plan for how to make that ferry sustainable. The issue is not whether we should have a ferry, it's whether they're competent to actually get it done. And I'll give you another example, Mr. Speaker. We now know that the ferry, the Nova Star ferry, that we're all paying for, is scheduled to spend the winter at Fort Pierce, Florida, just south of Orlando. And at this point, just a week before it's due to get there, there is yet no confirmed work for the ferry for the winter. We all hope it gets work for the winter, Mr. Speaker, but at this point, it's due to go and dock at a private marina south of Orlando next week. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier if he will be upfront and tell Nova Scotians, if there is no winter work, what is the maximum amount that Nova Scotians are on the hook for that ferry to spend its winter in Florida?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, is that this government, this caucus, will continue to work with Nova Scotians to ensure that we have a long-term viable link, Mr. Speaker, going from Yarmouth to the United States, Mr. Speaker. That service is important to all Nova Scotians, and if that party doesn't support it, stand up in this House, put their names on the record. They're not prepared. They're not prepared to support that vital international link.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is through you to the Premier. The current outbreak of Ebola virus was identified in December of last year in Guinea, West Africa. It quickly spread to Liberia and Sierra Leone. It is now present in over 7 countries, Mr. Speaker. Almost a year later, frontline healthcare workers in Nova Scotia are still without proper protective equipment and training. So my question through you, Mr. Speaker, is to the Premier. Is the Premier satisfied with his government's response to the Ebola outbreak thus far?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. Dr. Strand has been doing a tremendous job for this province, Mr. Speaker, for a number of years. He's doing a tremendous job on this file, and we will continue to work side by side with Dr. Strand to ensure that the people of this good province and those that provide health care to the people of this province are working in safe environments.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, when asked about the Ebola outbreak, the Minister of Health said, and I quote, "Our province is in an extremely low-risk category," end quote, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health may not agree, but the reality is that we live in a global society, not far removed, Mr. Speaker, from the rest of the world. Our province has strong connections to African countries and travel to and from Africa by people in Nova Scotia, including doctors, humanitarian workers, students, for example, is more common than I think the Health Minister would like to think. So I'd like to ask, through you, Mr. Speaker, why is the Premier allowing his minister to minimize the risk of Ebola when precautions like proper protection equipment and training should have been provided months ago?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to tell all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, how proud I am of the work that the Minister of Health has been doing on behalf of all members to ensure that we have a sustainable health care system, Mr. Speaker, one, Mr. Speaker, that all Nova Scotians, those that are providing health care to our citizens and those that are accessing health care in our system, recognize that it's a safe working environment, Mr. Speaker. And I want to again tell the member that Dr. Strand is continuing to do the great work that he's been doing on behalf of the people of the province of Nova Scotia, and we're going to continue to work side by side with Dr. Strand to ensure that Nova Scotians are protected.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would agree. We have a great dedicated workforce and healthcare workforce here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. But they are not prepared. We're being told that equipment is on back order. It's not arrived yet, Mr. Speaker. So those healthcare workers are concerned. And I'd like to, through you, Mr. Speaker, ask the Premier, what can the Premier tell those healthcare workers who are looking for that equipment, or how can he alleviate their anxiety, which they have currently, Mr. Speaker, because of that equipment not being available as we stand here today?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to respond to the member's question. First of all, I will restate that Nova Scotia is a very low-risk area to have a case of Ebola, but no place, as we know, is 100% secure in that regard. What we know today is that the Federal Minister of Health, in fact, had a telephone conversation with all health ministers last evening as a response to the Canadian Nursing Association and the concerns that they raised. We know that we have the best in protective gear, and in fact, if we don't have the very best, we know that it's on its way.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to go back to the issue of the ferry, and I just want to put the Premier's mind at ease that, of course, we support the Yarmouth Ferry. Of course, we support the thing. And I'm going to remind him also, and I'm going to also, they should be proud to stand there and answer questions about the Yarmouth Ferry, because the previous government didn't let us ask questions about the previous ferry problem. They just went and cancelled it without us having an opportunity to bring it up in this House of Assembly. So we should be proud to ask questions about the Yarmouth Ferry in this House of Assembly. So with that, question's been raised about whether the minister signed a good deal or a bad deal. And this is what we're hearing in our communities now. To put us at ease, the minister assured taxpayers that the executives of Nova Star Ferries would only be receiving half their salaries until the ferry became profitable. And when asked about what those salaries were, the minister said, well, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. So the minister's had a couple of days to collect that information. We'll table today the salaries of those executives for Nova Star Ferries, his partners in the ferry business.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, from day one, we posted the agreement on our website for all Nova Scotians to see. Any time that we've had to advance funds, we've shared that with Nova Scotians. We've shared our challenges along the way. One of the things we were able to do from the deal that had been negotiated by the previous government was to add in a clause that unless the ferry was turning a profit, the management team would only be able to draw 50% of their salaries. I've instructed the company to release that information, and it will be made public this afternoon.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that answer. And again, we're having the opportunity to discuss this issue as it stands before us in this House of Assembly. In that same scrum yesterday, the Minister said we've been as transparent through this as possible with you, and that will not change. He also said that in his capacity as Minister, he has seen correspondence indicating possible alternative routes and complete alternative business plans. Does that mean this service is going to continue the way it is, or if it's not? Not too sure with that kind of comment. So, in the interest of this transparency, will the Minister share that correspondence with the House of Assembly so that we can develop an informed opinion about the future of that service between Portland and Yarmouth?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I was asked whether I had received any other suggestions about ferry services, and if the member had listened a bit longer, I had also suggested that some were considered to be not overly serious or credible. What I've received basically is one-page emails or one-page letters outlining an interest in providing a ferry service to Nova Scotia. I would suggest to the honourable member that we did not take those overly serious in light of the presentation, but at the same time it was very clear that the province had entered into an agreement with Nova Star to provide a ferry service. We are going to continue to work with the operator. I'm sure the member would appreciate, as he's pointed out, the first year of a ferry service that was cancelled by the previous government 4 years ago naturally has brought with it challenges, and we certainly look forward to working together with all of our partners to try to ensure the success and long-term viability of this service for the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know the Minister can understand the the concern that people have about the ferry service because of the experience that they've had over the last number of years. And they want to make sure that this is going to be viable from here into the future. But when we see a government reacting and cutting other checks or actually committing up to $5 million 1 week and another week something else might come along, we're just asking whether there's an opportunity for a plan to be drafted so that people can be comfortable that this ferry service will be here into the future. So my question to the Minister is that can he table as much information as he can and maybe provide us a plan here to 5 years of where we're going with this ferry service?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Speaker, I'm not quite sure how advancing another $5 million for a ferry service should put anyone's mind in doubt as to what our commitment has been to the service. Speaker, that I would file that under asking a question to say you asked a question. But in reality, Mr. Speaker, I would strongly suggest that to the honourable member, if any Nova Scotians or any of his constituents are concerned about our support for maintaining a ferry service between Yarmouth and Portland, if they don't feel confident in speaking with our own government members, I would advise them to contact Mayor Pam Mood of Yarmouth and ask her what her thoughts are on this government's commitment to seeing the Nova Star continue.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. There is no group more vulnerable to inflation than individuals receiving income assistance. Between 2010 and 2014, the income assistance rate increased by 22%, which works out to an extra $47 per month for those who are receiving income assistance. But in 2014, the Minister of Community Services froze the income assistance rates. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister is why is the Minister of Community Services placing even more financial pressures on families already struggling to get by?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I thank the Honourable Member for her question. Nobody knows, Mr. Speaker, probably better than a few of us in this House that have had financial struggles and have lived on the income assistance system, how difficult it is to make ends meet and to provide shelter and food for our families. Shelter rates have not risen since 2006, of which 4 years the previous minister was the Minister of Community Services, and also for the first year that she was in government as minister, the income assistance personal allowance also did not rise. I made a commitment a year ago. I will follow through on that commitment that I'm going to get my own house in order within the Department of Community Services so that we can best provide the best services, benefit package, and help and assistance to vulnerable Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for her answer. But I will remind the Honourable Member that we initiated the Income Assistant Review Program, and we took a holistic approach in terms of the increases that were created within that department, that people actually received up to over $1,500 to $3,000 more at the end of our mandate in terms of what they were receiving in the province of Nova Scotia, not through just income assistance, but all the programs that we encapsulated together as one and took that approach. Mr. Speaker, in July 4th article in The Coast, a community services spokesperson said the department's review would improve the IA program as a whole, and I will table that article. When will the minister table these recommendations in the House to give some assurance to those who are receiving income assistance waiting to hear about these changes?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
The benefit reform review, Mr. Speaker, has been ongoing for a couple of months. We are now getting into the nitty-gritty of it. I would suggest that what we're doing is far more comprehensive than what the former minister had initiated. We have built on some programs that were started by the previous government. We've improved them, we've expanded them, particularly for persons with disabilities, and also within service providers, particularly focusing on strengthening community organizations that help families in crisis and in poverty. I'll release those changes when the department is ready to release those changes and not a minute before.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the previous Liberal government of the 1990s also failed to keep income assistance rates at pace with inflation, resulting in a serious deficiency that proved challenging to overcome by the subsequent governments. So my question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister of Finance, how many years will her government freeze the income assistance rate?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And that is an area that we have not had long discussions with, so I would say. Exactly. I think it's a question that really is for the Minister of Community Services. We've certainly had discussions around the need to address poverty, and I'll leave it to her to speak in the specifics.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just am at a loss because personal allowance rates were frozen in the first mandate year of the previous minister, and shelter rates were not touched by 1 penny in the 4 years they were in government. Compound that with the $17 million they took out of the budget when they went from 12 months to 11 months, which would have impacted people on income assistance and service providers in a very negative way. I don't understand why we're frozen and back in 2010 that wasn't seen as frozen. So we're not trying to balance the backs of people, the budget on the backs of people like the previous government. I'm committed here today to making this system better, and I will not release anything before it's ready to be released.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in this House, in question period, the Premier said, and I quote, "We are not in any way banning anything in this province." Well, that's not what the Minister of Energy says, Mr. Speaker, because I have with me the press release that the Energy Department put out on September 3rd, and the title of that release, Mr. Speaker, is "Government to Prohibit Hydraulic Fracturing." Sounds like a ban to me. And for greater clarity, I will go on to quote quickly from the release. It says, "The Government of Nova Scotia will introduce legislation this fall to prohibit high-volume hydraulic fracturing for onshore shale gas." It also says, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "We will therefore introduce legislation to prohibit using this technique to stimulate onshore shale projects." It further goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, quoting from the words of the Minister of Energy, in referring to the support of the Mi'kmaq Chiefs, he says, "They express support for the government's decision to prohibit hydraulic fracturing operations in shale petroleum developments." Now, I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, who is running the show over there, but there clearly is a difference of opinion between the Premier and the Minister of Energy about whether they're banning anything or not. Well, you know what, Mr. Speaker? All Nova Scotians know that the government is banning a new way to create new jobs in this province. So I ask the Premier, why not just admit the obvious, that he is, in fact, banning a new way to create new jobs?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to take a moment to thank and congratulate the Minister of Energy for the tremendous work that he's been doing. I want to thank him, Mr. Speaker, for going out and engaging Nova Scotians on a whole host of energy issues, Mr. Speaker. I was very impressed at a public meeting he held that I was at, and the engagement by the citizens that were there, Mr. Speaker, I don't think I've ever seen, quite frankly, at a public engagement by an elected official. And I want to continue to ensure the honourable member that the Minister of Energy will continue to listen to all Nova Scotians. He'll continue to look for economic opportunities out of the Energy Department, just like every minister in this government is going to continue to do, look for economic opportunities in the department to drive economic growth and keep good jobs here at home.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if that was a yes or a no, but I will say I wish that the Minister of Energy or the Premier himself had engaged the 8,700 Nova Scotians who lost their job last year, or the 50,000 Nova Scotians that's estimated to be working out west today, because this question, Mr. Speaker, about banning new ideas is at the heart of whether we're going to try new things in this province or not. The Minister says it's a prohibition. The Premier says it isn't. This is an important issue, and is too important to create this kind of confusion when real jobs or real potential jobs are at stake, Mr. Speaker. So I'll ask the Premier, can he explain to this House the difference between a prohibition and a ban?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, not only do we engage those Nova Scotians, I drove one of them to the airport this morning and put up on a plane to fly out west, Mr. Speaker, but I'll tell you one thing. One thing this government will continue to do is listen to all Nova Scotians and ensure that public policy represents the views of all Nova Scotians to make sure that our future is sustainable, not one that looks at public policy that only wants to divide communities across this province. This government will speak to Nova Scotians and will speak to them in a unified way to ensure that we move this province forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, that was interesting, but in no way answered the question that I asked, leaving Nova Scotians wondering. We have a Premier that says there's no ban and a Minister of Energy that says there's a complete prohibition. Mr. Speaker, it's a very important question. The Premier wants to unify Nova Scotians. So do we. Let's unify them here at home, in this province, working together, families united, doing jobs that they're already doing out west, except doing it here. There's a real plan to create jobs, Mr. Speaker, but that's exactly what the Premier has banned, or prohibited, or stopped, or whatever word they want to use, Mr. Speaker. But with 8,700 jobs lost in the past year, if he won't tell us, will the Premier at least explain to them why he is banning or prohibiting or stopping a new way of creating new jobs in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're continuing to work. We're continuing to work with the private sector to drive economic opportunities and job growth. Mr. Speaker, you want to know, Mr. Speaker, who's confusing the people of this province is the leader of the Conservative Party. On one day, he stands up and says he wants a municipal amalgamation, only wants 18 municipal units, Mr. Speaker. Lo and behold, when it hits the community that he visits periodically, Mr. Speaker, when it hits Spring Hill, Mr. Speaker, he starts changing his mind. Mr. Speaker, that is the member who also told us to close the Pictou pulp mill, but don't lay anybody off, Mr. Speaker. You can't have it both ways, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Natural Resources. As the Minister knows, I have called on an archaeologist to be present during explorations on Oak Island. In question period, the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage agreed and has also written to the permit holders advising the men to hire an archaeologist to monitor activity. The Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage also said that he cannot enforce that an archaeologist be on site, as that is a decision that is with the Department of Natural Resources, and the license goes under them, and I will table that answered, Mr. Speaker. My question through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister is, will the government ensure that an archaeologist is present to monitor all further explorations on Oak Island?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When someone is pursuing a treasure hunt in Nova Scotia, according to the laws that have been set out by this legislature, they are operating under a different piece of legislation, particularly in Oak Island. That piece of legislation was brought in 2010 by the previous NDP government, Mr. Speaker. If the member opposite has any questions related to that, perhaps she could discuss the situation with her colleagues that brought that particular piece of legislation in.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that the Minister did not answer the question. I've had conversations with him and explained at that time that there was not the awareness of this particular theory that is coming from Petter Emberson from Norway, and that the discoveries that are being made are based on that theory, that are heritage artifacts. So, Mr. Speaker, to date, there is still no on-site monitoring on Oak Island, despite the fact that the exploration continues. The island's heritage objects could be damaged during the search for treasure if changes are not made to the Oak Island Treasure Act or Special Places Protection Act to make the presence of an archaeologist mandatory. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, why is the government not bringing forward legislation to ensure all treasure and heritage objects on Oak Island are protected?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The proponents in this particular case are operating according to the law. The law in this particular circumstance was written and adopted by the previous NDP government.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister's not seeming to get it. It's not about what happened previously. There's new information about Oak Island, and that's why we're pursuing the need to have an archaeologist mandatory, and that's not a no-brainer. That's an easy solution that the Minister himself can do to protect Oak Island and what is found there, and protect the heritage for Nova Scotians, and protect tourism and cultural opportunities in the future, so the treasures do not leave if anything is found, and then all we have is a hole in the ground. So, Mr. Speaker, my final supplementary is for the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage, and I would like to ask the Minister, who owns the treasure and heritage objects found thus far on Oak Island, and will the Minister table a list of these items in the House?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The items, first of all, you have to separate. There's treasures and there's artifacts. The artifacts belong to the people of Nova Scotia, the province of Nova Scotia. Treasure is an item that once the licensee has the permission to do the digging, they own that treasure. Now, they are to give the province a royalty on that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. You can probably guess what it's going to be about. Last spring, I asked the Minister whether the government would show concrete support for Nova Scotians suffering with Lyme disease, and we also talked about how many Nova Scotians are forced to leave the province to get diagnosed and treated for the disease. At the time, I was pleased to read the Minister say, and I quote here, and I'll table it, "If we don't have tests throughout the geography of the province and regional hospitals, I'm committed to moving on that." Will the Minister please explain what action the Department of Health has taken since April to ensure that there are tests throughout the province and Nova Scotians no longer have to travel to the United States?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And at this point, we don't have the statistical profile for 2014, obviously, but for 2013, there were 154 confirmed and probable cases, and they have been able to get the proper regimen of treatment in our province. I know some years ago there were definitely gaps in the system, and now with the work at the IWK, the QE2, and right across our regions, there is indeed a protocol of both testing and treatment that is in place.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that number of confirmed cases, I know I'm hearing from Nova Scotians all the time with concerns about the diagnosis they're getting on the spot. So that's a number that likely could, I'm sure the Minister would say, would go up. But in that same April newspaper article, the Minister of Health said he believed that giving Lyme disease a greater focus and greater effort was the best way to getting up to speed on education, diagnostic area, and treatment for Lyme disease. Certainly Nova Scotians who are suffering with the disease agree that it's time for a greater focus and greater effort when it comes to their diagnosis and treatment. So will the Minister tell the House what form of greater focus and greater effort he's instructed the Department of Health to take?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the Department of Health and Wellness, we now have a provincial campaign, one that focuses on the 6 endemic areas in particular. And I know this year in DHAs 1, 2, and 3, There was a greater focus on making sure that the clinicians have a much better understanding of the disease, and in fact, with the work as well in support by Doctors Nova Scotia, we know that we are in a much better position in 2014 than at any time in the past decade.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. And, we all want Nova Scotians with Lyme disease to get the treatment and support they need and deserve, and we need to be screening properly even for ticks through certain areas. So I was glad to hear the Minister's focus on that. But and I would also like just to give the Minister one more opportunity to give Nova Scotians some assurance, particularly those that are suffering with Lyme disease, that they will benefit from a truly provincial approach to tackling Lyme disease.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased the member opposite has raised this important public health issue in our province. We know that finally, as well, it's being recognized by the federal government. They have put in place in Atlantic Canada a public health officer dealing solely with Lyme disease. We also know that the Department of Labour, Advanced Education, the Labour component in particular, now have undertaken a very direct program to have their workers that are in our forestry, our mining, surveyors, Department of Transportation, who are much more likely to get a tick bite. That again, a whole program to support them is in place, and right now we're working with the federal government, and we're hoping to be able to engage in some type of provincial conference that in fact will bring greater attention to this disease.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you today is for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, according to Statistics Canada, while the NDP was in government, Nova Scotia was the only province in the country to see an increase in the number of farms. For years, farmers had called on the provincial government to create a plan for the agriculture sector, and in 2012 they got one. A minister with a vision who cared about farmers and wanted to create a more viable industry. So, can the minister please give the House an update on the status of government's 10-year plan for agriculture called Homegrown Success?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. Thank the Honourable member for the question. We are indeed continuing with that program and have had some success moving that forward, and it's a very important program. And we, I believe, at the present time, and I have to check the stats on this, we have the fastest growing number of new farmers in the country. Thank you.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that remark and the answer, and I agree with him. It's something that Nova Scotia can be proud of, the growing number of farms in our province. Growing our agricultural sector is very good for all Nova Scotians. We have to do what we can to help our farmers become more sustainable while ensuring safety of the food and people is also paramount. There are concerns, however, right now across the province that the current government is cracking down on small independent operators with regulations that they feel are geared toward big industry. So my question for the minister is this: what new programs, funding or training is the minister going to provide to help those farmers and small processors who are struggling to meet the standards that are being forced upon them?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much again for that question. The truth is we are not forcing any new standards on the industry. We have in place programs to help people get certified if they decide to get certified under processing facilities, and we encourage them to do that. It's a voluntary process, and unfortunately most of the facilities have not approached us to that effect. If they do, the cost for doing that is absolutely free. From our standpoint, there's no inspection fees, there's no fees for any kind from our department, and we strongly encourage people to do that, but again, it's totally voluntary.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, thank you for that answer to the Minister. Perhaps he might be able to provide us a phone number or a website, email that small processors and small farmers could contact to find out what they need to do in order to bring themselves up to the standards that are necessary. Mr. Speaker, during the election in 2013, the Liberals did talk a good talk on their election commitments regarding agriculture, but so far they haven't really walked the walk on certain promises. Promises that they made included, which I will table, expanding local products in academic and healthcare facilities, expanding the agriculture in the classroom program, and expanding the buy local program. And I will table that, Mr. Speaker. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is does the minister plan to implement these commitments? And if so, when? And if not, why not?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. That's multiple questions there. But indeed, the answer to all the questions are we are definitely working on all those programs. We've made significant progress in all areas, and we will continue to work with other departments, such as the Department of Health and other the school boards, in order to put the training in the classroom, more in the classrooms. We recently announced a book that was for the grade 6 classes that talks more about agriculture, local food in the Department of Health and other areas. We're working very closely with those departments and starting initiatives in that area. So we are on track with our election promises, and we will continue to grow the industry. And it's important that we put as many farmers to work as we can in Nova Scotia and make sure every product that we can produce in Nova Scotia we can sell here or export, and indeed help our economy as we intend to do through the Department of Agriculture.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister is well aware, there are real economic benefits for businesses and homeowners associated with gaining access to natural gas. The government's bill that has passed second reading will enable a greater amount of investment into natural gas distribution infrastructure through the province. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is this. What dialogue has the Minister had regarding the potential expansion of natural gas services to more communities in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. It's something that's actually near and dear to my heart because I'm one of those Nova Scotians who would like to access natural gas at my own home. This is something that we've been working with not only Heritage Gas, but the bill before the legislature, should it pass the legislature, will allow other companies to get into the market. We already know Irving Energy is, well, they're already actually, in fact, providing CNG services to Acadia. We're talking about build-outs of systems, and one of the things that the Minister of Health has done is ensure that the hospitals in the province are largely moving to natural gas, many of them through CNG opportunities, which will allow the creation of satellite systems in those areas. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Thank the Minister through you, Mr. Speaker, for that answer. And one of the areas that I'm especially interested in seeing is expanded natural gas services in the Valley, and I know that he has already mentioned a couple. There is a feeling that the potential anchor load for customers has been is near being achieved in the Valley, as we see Michelin, Acadia University, the Valley Regional Hospital, and possibly more large anchor users going online with natural gas. With the supply of inexpensive natural gas in the Valley, the region will be even more attractive to potential investors. Has the Minister considered bringing large supplies of natural gas to the Valley from an economic development perspective?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure exactly what he means about bringing large supplies there, so I'll try to interpret his question. But there are a number of large anchor loads that we have met with who are looking at the possibility of taking CNG services. We have met with the municipalities as well as the suppliers of CNG to see whether they would be willing to put in satellite systems which would connect those various anchor loads, which obviously would then allow people to connect off that existing pipeline. The reality is that in the valley in particular, not everybody is going to get natural gas, even under the best case scenario, just because of the distances from that pipeline. However, it is one of the areas that we are actively working with, and quite frankly, many of the suppliers are waiting to see whether the legislation passes first.
The honourable member for Kings North on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. To get to where we're going to in this question, it is that while we're happy to have CNG, the interest in the valley is to have a pipeline up through the old DAR railway, and there is a feeling that there is enough customers there, or there could be, in the valley for a pipeline. Certainly the farms, there's many farms that have converted to propane and could easily convert to natural gas, and large chicken barns are with very large users. So will the government, my question, Mr. Speaker, is will the government engage in the necessary stakeholders to investigate whether a pipeline is possible into the Annapolis Valley?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell the member that that's already been looked at. And in fact, the economics are not there to run a pipeline off the existing Maritimes and Northeast pipeline system, just because of the sheer number of kilometres that would be involved in order to get off that pipeline. It's the same reason why that problem has existed in Truro. It's the same reason why Antigonish is actually doing a satellite system, and they're even closer actually than the valley to the existing pipeline system. But I would be more than happy to sit down with the member and actually have some of the experts on this in our department sit down with the member and sort of walk him through some of the challenges. Some of the customers that he's talked about are exactly the customers we would love to get natural gas and those opportunities too. There are some cost challenges. I think the member would know, even looking at a farm, the length of distance from the road, even if you had it along the road right to the barn, is sometimes a barrier for a natural gas system. But I'd be more than happy to have myself and our staff sit down and discuss the opportunities and challenges with that member.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Environment. Mr. Speaker, last fall I asked both the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Energy to address the issue of fly ash coming from the power plant in Trenton. The soot covers people's cars, gardens, houses, and entire properties. It is both an environmental and a health concern for these residents. Both ministers told me last year that they had a meeting scheduled with Hillside Trenton Environmental Watch in January of this year. The Minister of Energy spoke about this for the first time Tuesday. There doesn't appear to be any progress. The group thinks this is an example of the minister telling this group what they want to hear to keep them quiet. My question to the minister, why has the minister failed to address this issue?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. With respect to this particular situation, in fact, when this question came to the House in, I believe, December of last year, the Minister of Energy and I both responded to the question, indicated that we were planning and already had a meeting scheduled with the concerned citizens on this issue. In fact, since that time, in January, we followed through with that meeting. We met the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Health, and myself, as well as our respective staff members, met with that group. Following that, I know the Minister of Energy has had conversations and been in frequent contact with certainly some of the leaders of that group. I myself sat down with staff members in Pictou, went down to the area, which would be much closer to reduce the travel time for the concerned citizens, and had further discussions, had the opportunity to review additional information that they provided, Mr. Speaker. Certainly very engaged on the file, but as I'd indicated, actually, Mr. Speaker, I suppose at this point I'll let them ask the follow-up question, but there is more to say. Sorry.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm aware of the information that the Minister has just passed on. Once again, Mr. Speaker, this group has been very active for a number of years, and they told me they're there to stay. Mr. Speaker, 1 year later, the Minister of Energy told reporters that the government was doing what it can within current regulations, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. This should not have been a new realization. This issue was something the Minister of Energy took great interest in while in opposition. Checking regulations should not have been a shock to the government, and he had a year to do so. My question to the Minister, will the Minister be making changes to regulations to allow action to be taken?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the member's right. We took great interest in this in opposition, and we still take great interest in the interest we took. And if the member goes back and checks Hansard, the request we made was for government officials to sit down, work with the group, and give them a realistic timeline on when this would be solved, what the challenges are. In opposition, I personally delivered to Mr. Boyles the industrial approval at the time to his house. I drove it down to Pictou and dropped it off to him. And Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Environment, and myself have met with the group. We've walked them through what the options are, what the timelines are. We have also been walking them through the IRP process with Nova Scotia, which is currently underway. And the Minister of the Environment has committed to the group that as the industrial approval comes up in the next 18 to 24 months, I believe is the timeline, that the issues they have raised will be addressed or will be looked at as part of that industrial approval process review. And yesterday and previously, I've spoken with the President of Nova Scotia Power, and they are aware of that as well.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is also for the Minister of the Environment. Last summer, the government signed an agreement with Pictou Landing First Nation regarding the long-promised remediation of the Boat Harbour Waste Treatment Facility. All residents of Pictou County have long awaited action on this issue and are eager to know what the government plans to do and when. So can the Minister update the House on the plans regarding the cleanup of Boat Harbour, please?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the member for bringing this question to the House. It does give me great pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to come here and speak to this very important issue for the first time since we hadn't sat when that agreement was signed in June. That opportunity, that experience, and that agreement that we entered into with the Chief and Council of Pictou Landing First Nation, I'd like to first and foremost acknowledge the work of the Chief and Council, Chief Andrea Paul and Council. In the work that they did, Mr. Speaker, during June to sit down and with myself and representatives of the Government of Nova Scotia to work out and come to an agreement, Mr. Speaker, that was to the satisfaction of both parties. Mr. Speaker, the opportunity was quite important, and so are the results. As far as an update, I guess I'm getting the motion for the time. If I can follow up in the supplement, I'll give more and more update to that, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Yeah, I mean the update's really what we're looking for, and I guess when the Minister stands back up, I'm sure we'll get that. But after so many years of inaction, all of the people of Pictou Landing, including the people of the Pictou Landing First Nations, are concerned about this issue, and they're rightfully frustrated because it's an important issue, and all of the people want to be included in the process. So the residents of the entirety of Pictou Landing would like to see public meetings held in the area to allow their input on the government's plans for Boat Harbour. So when the Minister provides his update on what he's done so far, I wonder if he would commit to holding public meetings in the coming weeks so that all of the residents can be included in the process.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess as far as an update, what I want to indicate is that the agreement we entered into to let the members of the House that may not be aware, members of the public, the agreement explicitly indicates that we are committed to ending the flow of effluent into the Boat Harbour facility as well as the long-term remediation of the area. As far as the progress, Mr. Speaker, on that particular issue, we've established a committee that has representatives both from Pictou Landing First Nation, representatives representatives, elder representatives, as well as a member of the council and other members from their community, Mr. Speaker, as well as representatives from the government of Nova Scotia. We've learned from past experiences with environmental challenges, in particular, Mr. Speaker, the work that was done on the Sydney Tar Ponds, an environmental disaster situation in this province that many thought at the time would be insurmountable, that could never be achieved. And yet, Mr. Speaker, in the past year, we've seen the opening of a fantastic park in that area. We've seen that even in the face of some of the most problematic environmental disasters, Mr. Speaker, that with a lot of hard work, a lot of commitment, and with the will, we can move forward. Much is the case behind the direction and the plan and how we're moving forward on the Boat Harbour file. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the minister for his answer. I was listening intently to the makeup of the committee, and I can assure the minister that all of the residents of the area want to be part of that solution, and they want to be part of the process. So I would ask the minister today if he'd consider adding a couple other residents from the area on that committee, and I'd specifically ask him if he would include Jane Thompson, who's a local lady whose family's been there for generations. She's very knowledgeable on the subject. She'd love to be part of the process.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, at this point in time, there are no plans to change the composition of that committee. We put a lot of work building the trust with and coming to the agreement that we came to. A lot of the work that was put in place through the month of July was actually in determining and establishing both the terms of reference and the makeup of the committee working on this file. And moving forward, Mr. Speaker, we've made a commitment to address this issue and bring legislation before this House by the June of next year, Mr. Speaker. To start changing the course of action now, Mr. Speaker, might put the entire process at risk.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. The Mineral Resources Act states that the Crown owns all minerals in or upon land in the province and the right to explore for, work, and remove those minerals. Currently, there is a plan in Colchester County to empty salt caverns in Alton and flush the salt into the Shubenacadie River. But that proposal now faces a potential treaty rights conflict, according to Chief Rufus Copage and his Shubenacadie First Nations Band Council. So my question is, will the Minister of Natural Resources meet with Chief Copage and Alton Gas to consider alternate options for using the salt in the caverns rather than dumping it into the Shubenacadie River?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One thing that I think we can take great pride in the province of Nova Scotia is we have a model of First Nations consultation that is a leader in the country. We take our legal and treaty obligations very seriously with our First Nations Mi'kmaq communities, and of course, whenever there's any concerns on any sort of resource extraction or use of Crown land, we engage in very substantial and meaningful consultation with them, as we're obliged to by law.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his answer, and I would agree with him that this is an extremely important issue for First Nations and for the province and the people of our province. However, Chief Rufus Copage was quoted as saying that consultation does not mean consent, and he would like to have further consultations with both the Alton Gas and the province. So my second question, Mr. Speaker, is the annual is for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. So, Mr. Speaker, the annual production of salt in Cumberland and Colchester counties provides more than enough to meet Nova Scotia's industrial needs, but we could be exporting significant quantities of salt to other markets. In a Chronicle Herald article, which I will table, the Vice President of the Nova Scotia Division of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters said that exports are increasingly important to economies with small domestic markets such as ours. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development agree to meet with Alton Gas and the Shubenacadie Band to consider export opportunities for the salt brine now that the Shubenacadie First Nations say their eel traps make the salt brine disposal site an active treaty fishing area for their people?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to meet with any interested groups looking at exploring export opportunities for our province and helping grow our economy, and would be more than happy to meet with the parties that the member has identified.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Millbrook, Bible Hill, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that response. I will definitely follow up with that with his office and with the other interested people. Mr. Speaker, my final supplementary is for the Minister of Agriculture. The Minister of Environment told us last week that a permit is required from the Department of Agriculture to approve any impacts to the dike lands of the Alton Gas project. Can the Minister please tell us if Agriculture staff have confirmed that work conducted near the dike by the Alton Gas contractor last week have weakened the dike, and what their plans are to protect that dike from high tides?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. And indeed, there was some work done on the site by Alton Gas that was not authorized by our department. There is not an agreement in place yet to do that work, and we are investigating the condition of the dike.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre with 40 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. Mr. Speaker, literacy is a basic foundation for successful futures. Poor literacy limits opportunities and leads to poverty. In today's information age, poor literacy is crippling. A Conference Board of Canada report released in 2012 showed that more than 40% of adults in Nova Scotia had inadequate literacy skills, and the board gave Nova Scotia a D grade. Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. My question to
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business with the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call address and reply?
We'll now call address and reply, and we'll continue on with the Honourable Member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Government House Leader for ensuring we were able to do this today. Mr. Speaker, one of the things mentioned in the speech from the throne was an indication that a sexual violence strategy will be released in the year ahead. We can all agree that we need to do all we can in this legislature to prevent sexual abuse. Today, I will be speaking about some of the sexual abuse that occurred in the Strait area and how we must support